This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Everyone, and welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. This is our special Fight the Future Minute podcast. I'm Kurt North, and you are listening to the coverage of minute 55 of the X-Files Fight the Future. This minute begins at 54 minutes as Conrad Strughold. This minute begins at 54 minutes as Conrad oh my God, Darren.
You're struggling with Strughold, are you?
This minute, yeah, I am. I might leave that in. This minute begins at 54 minutes as Conrad Strughold eschews the Well-Manicured Man. They will use the aliens and ends at 54:59 with Scully mid-sentence explaining there's no evidence of a dig site in the deserts of Dallas. To discuss this minute, I am joined once again for the final time for this little batch of minutes with Darren Mooney. Darren, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really looking forward to the Deserts of Dallas as kind of an X-Files spin-off novel.
That would be good. Yeah. The Deserts of Dallas, that instantly brings to mind some form of soap opera. Obviously Dallas being Dallas, but the Deserts of Dallas would definitely be a mixture of Dallas and the X-Files would be absolutely amazing. So we've finally come into this section. Overall, within this, it's very exposition heavy, isn't it? We had the conversation last episode about what Stahl had to put up with Chris Carter's writing. In the context of all of these 4 or 5 minutes that we've done so far, where do you put that in place of the film? How do you think it fits in with the film overall? And the fact that it's kind of the middle part of it. It's really kind of explaining what's going on with the syndicate and stuff. What do you make to it?
It is worth noting, by the way, that like when and again, this is one of those, this is a movie for normies as well, so to speak. But again, this is one of the things where it's notable that Carter actually made an effort to explain the conspiracy or the mythology to casual audiences. I mean, very famously, the only place where you can hear Carter actually spell out what the mythology is about in plain English is as a hidden track on the soundtrack album to Fight the Future. But I think that even within Fight the Future itself, Carter's dialogue, and again, I mocked it last week. Yesterday, I had a good deal of fun with it. I think it is kind of a little bit hilarious, but is also very much blunt, simple, straight to the point. This is the stakes. This is what's going on. This is what we think. This is what they think. This is our relationship to them. This is our position. This is your difference from our position. This is your character motivation. It's all very, very simple kind of bullet point stuff. And again, a large part of that is just economics, because again, you're trying to compress all of this down into a 2-hour movie. And to be honest, Carter very, very shrewdly. And again, this feels a weird thing to say where you and I have been talking about the mythology and conspiracy stuff, for the better part of a week now. But it kind of feels strange to say that this actually isn't the really important part of the movie. Or at least Carter understands that like it's not the driving engine of the movie in kind of like a sense of audiences, bums in seats, eating popcorn, drinking Coke. The heart of the movie is Mulder and Scully and the relationship between Mulder and Scully, and the fact that the plot of the movie is basically a romantic comedy about whether Mulder will get Scully back to her job interview on time, and kind of the fun that goes from that, and hanging blockbuster scenes off that, and like the actual explanation of the mythology stuff that we've been talking about is very much incidental to that. I think it's very clear that it's less immediately important. It's there to make sense. It's there to kind of explain why there are bees happening, why there's fields of corn, where the characters are running to, what that giant monster came from and why it's there. But I think that the film wisely understands that, every minute that we spend talking about this stuff is a minute that we spend away from Mulder and Scully, and Mulder and Scully are a large part of the beating heart of the film and what are going to draw in mass audiences. So the way that we do this has to be efficient rather than elegant. And you can see that in some of the dialogue here, where Carter uses a lot more proper nouns and spells out a lot more bluntly the mechanics of how the conspiracy is working. Where you actually have, at the start of this minute, for example, sorry, I should stop calling him Stahl, Strughold, explaining that, we'll continue to use them as they do us, if only to play for more time to continue working on our vaccine, which is just, that's the motivation of the conspirators. That's what they're doing. That's why they're doing it. And it's spelt out in, a little over 15 words. And it's much blunter and much more straightforward than what you tend to get on the show, which is a lot more kind of lyrical, and what might be referred to as purple prose, the long conversations of characters walking through halls in, say, Redux 1 and Redux 2, to pick a couple of examples, where Carter has the space to talk about it poetically. And at the same time, to be fair to Carter and to be fair to the exposition here, it's still much better than the exposition in, say, the 9th season of the show, where Carter starts throwing in words like super soldier into the conversation, like it's just something people say. The exposition here is smart enough to understand that it still uses some of the abstract nouns that the show uses. It still uses colonization. It still uses vaccine. It still uses project. It still uses words that kind of make the sci-fi elements of the script seem less kind of goofy 50s B-movie and more like, well, this is, the Pelican Brief or Enemy of the State, or a relatable kind of grounded conspiracy theory, even to the point where we have monsters popping out of other characters' chests. And I think that, while we might mock, the delivery, the lines that Stahl is given, particularly as an actor whose first language isn't English, which makes it seem particularly cruel. While we might mock some of those lines, I think that there is an efficiency and economy to what Carter's doing. I think he knows why he's doing it, and I think he does it relatively well. And again, this gets into my thing with Fight the Future, where even if I don't think it's a perfect piece of the X-Files, and even if I don't think it's a perfect summer movie, I think it's pretty great as a fusion of those two things, because it understands the compromises inherent in trying to do both of those things, being a piece of X-Files and being a summer blockbuster. And I think that while I don't think the exposition is particularly elegant, while I don't think that the scenes with the Syndicate are particularly kind of compelling drama of themselves, while I think they're perhaps unnecessarily blunt and lack some of the poetry of the show's best handling of these themes, I also understand that there are reasons why that's the case, and I understand that Carter had to make decisions about where to put the focus of the film, and I understand that the bluntness of these scenes is a result of those decisions, and I think those decisions were fundamentally sound, which is just a long way around to saying I don't think these scenes are perfect, but I understand why they are the way they are, and I can absolutely forgive them for that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like some of the lines that are said. I mean, I know we were mocking them, but I don't mind a lot of the lot of exposition stuff that Carter throws in on occasion. That some of the monologues that he's thrown in the past, and all those kind of things that he's done. Apart from, as you say, when he gets to like season 9, or when he's literally telling you what's happening on screen, which is what we get in latest. I'm always going to refer back to My Struggle 3, where he's literally driving in a car, and he says he's driving in a car, kind of thing. But at this point, I still really enjoy this kind of back and forth, this conspiratorial conversation, which would never happen in a million years. A bit like tech speak on Star Trek, when you've got lines that, I think there's one where integral lighting something system breached in the Best of Both Worlds on Star Trek Next Generation, which basically means the lights went off. Things like that. It's just like, well, that just means the lights have gone off. So so there's aspects to it which I really enjoy, but there is things that we need to delve into with regards to some of the things that actually said within it, because there's a lot of depth to it as well, because we've got a wealth of information we've got 5 seasons before this, which have all gone into a lot of things that are actually said here, just not necessarily off the cuff, but they're referred to. Okay, so coming back, I mean, we've kind of finished mid-sentence, didn't we, of last episode, where we've got the well-manicured man saying that it doesn't think that turning over the infected body makes any difference. It just shows their hand. And Smoking Man's kind of like believing that they still have a role to play. And the show, the film at this point is putting us at ends with the Well-Manicured Man, saying, that this is basically all going to hell. This is Armageddon. But the rest of the syndicate are still kind of like, no, we need to hold on by our fingertips on this. But I just wanted to get your thing, because where we come into here is Strughold still believing that they can buy time to work on the vaccine. The word vaccine is really important here. We covered Season 5's Patient X and the Red and the Black, where Well-Manicured Man actually gets the vaccine. So what did you make to this first mention of the vaccine with the syndicate and the other string that they're looking at? Because we were looking at colonization last episode. Aliens were only going to control them, that they would become a slave race. Now they're finding out that it's going to be spontaneous repopulation of the planet. But then here, we're getting the other strand brought in, saying we need more time to work on our vaccines. How do you think that fits in with the show in the way that it's said, but also in the wider X-Files universe as a whole?
Well, I mean, in terms of the kind of the vaccine stuff, again, you're getting the show tapping into primal 90s anxieties. Again, it's notable that one of the rare episodes of the show where the cigarette-smoking man appears outside of the mythology is F. Emasculata from the second season. Whether or not you believe that's him in, I think, Young at Heart is another example of that. But yeah, like F. Emasculata is an episode that feels hugely important, not because it kind of ties in literally to the mythology, but because it establishes one of the core themes and preoccupations of the X-Files, which is this idea of viral Armageddon and the idea of kind of, being contaminated and having the spread of disease. And again, this taps into all manner of kind of 90s fears and anxieties. The Well-Manicured Man later on, and we'll probably talk about it then, mentions stuff like, say, AIDS and Ebola. You have Kurzweil's talked about stuff like the hantavirus as well, for an example. But you have this idea of there being a fear of contamination and a fear of kind of crossing. And again, this gets into another one of the anxieties of the X-Files, which is something that is interesting. And I think, as the show goes on, it's developed in interesting ways. I think the 8th season is very, very interesting in how it handles this. But the idea of contamination and hybridization and changing, and the idea of kind of altering, and the idea that one of the fears of one of the things about viral contamination and the fear of viral contamination is that despite the historical existence of kind of plagues like the Black Death, for example, but even say the Spanish flu after the First World War, the thing about viruses is that they make social structures dangerous. The more interconnected, and you can see it right now, obviously, with COVID-19. But the issue with viruses isn't necessarily the virus themselves, but the idea of how interconnected the world is, how close we all are, how intertwined we all are. And the idea that, the closer we get and the more deeply we integrate, the easier it is for something to kind of spread and contaminate and get in there. And again, this is one of the things that gets a kind of an anxiety that is a little bit uncomfortable, which is the idea of how we change and how we're altered and how interacting with these foreign elements kind of changes us and makes us different from what we were or how we saw ourselves at the start. And it's notable that for the members of the syndicate, salvation lies in this idea of hybridization, and this idea of a virus that is going to change you and make you literally alien. It's going to literally transform you. In the earlier episodes of the show, it possessed you, it altered you, it took control of your body. Here in the film, it actually literally changes you. It warps your DNA. And I mean, you see that when, Mulder and Scully are looking at the bodies, which are like translucent, like jelly, basically. They've actually been fundamentally altered by what they are. But it's notable that in order to survive, what you have to do to survive is you have to hybridize. You have to reconcile yourself and the other. And it's kind of, again, gets at this anxiety around how interconnected the world is, how close we all are to one another. And the idea that, it's notable that, again, going back to the Erlenmeyer flask, the name of this experiment or project has been purity. And the idea that, the colonists want purity. Because as we've discovered, this whole point with the transformation, that the black oil isn't just going to turn them into slaves, it's actually going to physically change them. That gets at the idea that, the colonists don't actually want human bodies. They don't want bodies that aren't their own. They just want bodies that they can transform into their own. They want purity. They want to be what they are. They want to remain what they are. They want to treat humans not as something that they become one with, not something that they integrate with, something that serves as basically birthing pods for them. And you have it as well with the conspirators as well, where the conspirators are largely trying to preserve themselves as they are. They are fighting in order to protect themselves and to protect the people around them. And again, it's interesting that as the show goes on, it embraces this idea that actually when you're confronted with these two kind of logger-jammed ideas of kind of purity, of like maintaining your identity, in inverted commas, no matter what, the show actually comes down and settles on this idea of hybridization as the solution, which is interesting. That it's not actually that the future of mankind doesn't necessarily lie in this idea of purity in inverted commas and again, the use of the word purity in the context of a mythology that is very firmly tied and rooted in the Second World War, and in particular in the context of a conspiracy that is headed by Strughold, who is a German who lives outside Germany and is a man of mystery and can therefore be inferred to possibly have had a past involved in Nazi Germany, but also explicitly in stuff like, say, 731 and even, say, the character Victor Klemper when he's talking about the orchids way back when in Paperclip and The Blessing Way. This idea that, you know, purity is something monstrous, something grotesque, and the idea is perhaps that in reconciling with the other, in integrating with the other, in rather than the colonists treating humans as, you know, stock, or the conspirators trying to preserve themselves no matter what, that the future maybe lies in hybridization is one of the interesting core themes of the X-Files. It's one of the big ideas that runs through the show. And it kind of, again, I think speaks to 90s kind of anxieties and uncertainties about a world that was getting smaller and more tightly integrated and more networked. And again, it's telling that, like, despite the fact that the cigarette-smoking man rings the well-manicured man up with seemingly a few hours' notice and says, look, we're all going to fly over to London, we're going to meet, and we're going to, you know, like the Strughold is flying in from Tunis. That's how close and interconnected the world is. Nobody is more than a few hours away at any given moment. That's how tightly intertwined it all is. And again, that's one of the core themes of the X-Files and something that I really, really like about the show. And something I think is very, very interesting in terms of its handling of stuff like the black oil and stuff like contamination and stuff like the idea of purity and hybridization. And I kind of find something vaguely hopeful in the emphasis the show places on the idea of not defeating the alien by, you know, maintaining your purity, but instead by reconciling it with yourself, at the risk of sounding as new agey as the script to, you know, The Blessing Way, for example.
There's nothing wrong with The Blessing Way, Darren, is there?
Well, I'm gonna hold back my comment on that one.
If you want to delve into that, look at The Blessing Way. Yeah, so I mean, just on the word the vaccine as well. I mean, this film was filmed before the events, pretty much the majority of season 5. There was reshoots during season 5, but they do bring the Well-Manicured Man in within the vaccine, that he's the one that actually gets it from Krychek. And I know that people have a thing that Krychek wasn't in this movie. I know have already mentioned before that we will no doubt mention Krychek in the next set of recordings that we are going to do, because I'm sure we'll get into that. But the fact that they've slotted the vaccine into the story just before into the movie, did you think that was an intelligent and a good thing to do? But on that, it was the Well-Manicured Man that actually brought the vaccine from Krychek into the movie. But then it's here where the Well-Manicured Man does also feel that his voice makes absolutely no difference. Now, we discussed this in previous minutes, but he doesn't seem to be used to being in that position, does he? He feels like he's losing grasp, he's losing control, and that will play on into the rest of the movie, really. But the fact that he brought the vaccine in and now he's feeling like he's losing control, how do you feel that all came together?
Well, I mean, again, this is the situation where Carter, maybe... And I mean, he himself will admit that he didn't always have a kind of a firm roadmap of where he's going. And I mean, when we talked about The Red and the Black, when we talked about Patient X, one of the things I liked about Patient X and The Red and the Black was the sense at which Carter was setting up certain ideas for the movie. And again, the vaccine is one of those ideas. But you could also tell that he was also just revving the engine on a motorcycle and introducing whole other concepts that he'd come up with in the time since he'd finished working on the movie. Characters like Spender, for example, that were going to be important later on. And there's a real sense of kind of the connection into the movie being very loose. And again, it's notable that, like, despite the fact that the well-manicured man in Patient X and The Red and the Black is very much kind of, he's the one who's pushing for working on the vaccine. And you get a sense of kind of the conspirators being kind of less, well, the vaccine's probably not gonna work.
Yeah.
Kind of their attitude seems to be in that two-parter is like, they're opposed to him in that two-parter because there's a sense that, oh, you and your kooky vaccine plan, as opposed to here where it's very much like, he's like we need to do something now. And they're like, it's okay. We'll figure out the vaccine, which is a kind of an interesting contrast between the kind of two of them. And again, I think that's down to the roughness of kind of the plotting. And I think it's down to the fact that, Carter was never always very good at kind of joining up dots. And that's why you end up with, I think the mythology, broadly speaking, makes a lot of sense in terms of the X-Files, but I think it makes more sense thematically than it does literally. Because obviously, like, you have things like the black oil, where what the black oil does and how it operates changes dramatically from one, episode to another. And you can come up with reasons to kind of justify that. You can say that, maybe the black oil that was in Piper Maru and Apocrypha had been down the bottom of the ocean so long, or maybe it had been affected by radiation, and maybe that's why it was behaving, or maybe the black oil that was being ferried around in Tunguska and Terma was inert, and that's why it's sort of, its infectees acted in the way that they did. But it kind of, when you're watching it, it does often feel like Carter was, I don't want to say making it up as he goes along, because I think he had a firm idea of what it was about in inverted commas. I think the points he wanted to make. But I think that some of the finer details were always kind of open to being finessed. I think, and again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that Carter was always open to there being a better idea in inverted commas, or another idea. And that's what I like about Patient X and The Red and the Black, is that you can see he's like, well, I have to line up the movie in certain ways. I have to set up this idea that there is a vaccine and that it works, and so I'm going to do that. But also, I have an idea for a cool character who's going to be like Mulder's half-brother, and sure, he's not in the film because I didn't have that idea yet, perhaps because, contract negotiations with David Duchovny weren't pushing my imagination in that direction, but that's a separate podcast. But it's like, so I'm going to just kind of shoehorn him in here because it's such a good idea. I don't want to have to wait until next year to introduce it. I don't want to have to, start fresh with the 6th season. I want to get it done now because it's fresh in my head and I'm going to do it. And I quite like that aspect of Carter's writing. And I think that it does cause problems down the line. I think that the, mythology starts out much stronger than it ends up. But I don't fault it for that. And I think that, again, this is one of those things where there's a sense of compromise to it. Again, it's like that characterization of the well-manicured man, which is slightly different between the show and the films, where Tunguska and Terma suggest that, he was possibly having an affair. Again, maybe he was divorced, maybe it's an unhappy family, but, there was a suggestion that he was involved in a romantic relationship that wasn't a conventional heteronormative family unit. And then that's contrasted with what you see here, where he's introduced with, oh, look at him. He's the one happy family man in the entire history of the X-Files. And kind of I understand why the film is kind of, again, I think I suggested 4 days ago, almost drawn in crayon version of the mythology, kind of this big, colourful version of the mythology, this version of the mythology that you can sit down and watch, having never watched the show before. I've watched the Fight the Future when the Blu-ray set came out with the entire series on it. Yeah. My roommate, who was a reasonable fan of the X-Files, he liked a lot of the standalone episodes. He would have watched it in bits and pieces. He never would have watched it religiously. He and our mutual partners at that time sat down, and this is actually quite lovely. We sat down and we watched Fight the Future because it was the big X-Files movie. We watched it together. I obviously very invested in the show, very invested in the minutiae of it, the kind of the continuity details. My roommate being more like, well, I've seen a couple of episodes. I know who Mulder and Scully are. I know who Eugene Victor Toombs is. I maybe recognize Fluke Man, that sort of level of familiarity. And his girlfriend and my girlfriend, who were both like, well, we know Scully is the short redhead and Mulder's the tall brunette. And all of four of us being able to get something out of the film, which I think is kind of a necessary compromise in that sense, where you need to set up those kind of conflicts very directly and very simply. So you can't have, the well-manicured man saying, yes, I've been saying work on the vaccine for several years now. And you just need to go to, but we're going to keep working on the vaccine, and him going, that's not enough. And I think that, it's, not to overuse the term, but a necessary evil, as it were. I don't even think it's that big an evil, if we're being frank.
No, I mean, I think it works well. I think as you just intimated there, the fact that the compromises that have to be made because it is a film, it is something that people are going to watch. People are going to get a lot of different things depending on where you're coming from it. The simple mention of a vaccine will easily, or could easily be picked up in later seasons and whatever, if it needed to do that, or and it doesn't have any major effect in the show as such. But then, which is a nice little through line here. But you mentioned about the two people who didn't know knew that Scully was the little redhead and Mulder was the tall brunette, because we might feel like we've been talking about this for almost a week and a half now, not quite a week and a half, maybe 4 or 5 days, but it's only been 2 or 3 minutes, and Mulder and Scully are getting brought back into the events now. We've already seen it briefly, and I think we mentioned it a couple of episodes ago where we saw it on the absolutely amazing TV set that they've got with the CCTV footage on it. But they bring Mulder in by saying that Kurzweil is being brought into it. Who's been saying that it's Kurzweil? No one believes Kurzweil. He's a total crank. And then by intimating that Mulder believes him, and Well-Manicured Man's reception to that kind of brings them back into the fold as such. So we're understanding now that Mulder and Scully are kind of coming back into the events that are happening around this. That the whole reason why the syndicate has been brought in is because they're getting too close to the truth, as they have done it so many times. But something that we've referred to with Strughold, that you've said a lot of the times about, effectively he's a Nazi, that although he hasn't, they don't openly say that, but it's inferred in some of the things that he's doing and some of the things that he is, and we've mentioned about the viruses, as you say, the idea of purity and stuff. But this Strughold, at this point in time, seems to have no F's given about Mulder being killed. Where in the past, Well-Manicured Man repeats what we've heard Cigarette Smoking Man say earlier in the show: kill Mulder, you turn one man's quest into a crusade. So that's kind of flipping a lot of the things that we've heard in the past about that. But it kind of repeats the beats of things like, Dwayne Barry and Sleepers and stuff, doesn't it? Where we're getting these kind of referring things, just kill Mulder. I'm the leader of the company. I just turn his quest into a crusade. But I do like the fact that they are repeating things from early in the show.
And again, recontextualizing as well. And again, this is the thing where, obviously you and I recognize that, the cigarette-smoking man has traditionally used that excuse. And again, that excuse has been kind of deepened and broadened over the run of the show. You've added layers of complexity to it. You've had the suggestion that the cigarette-smoking man is perhaps protecting Mulder out of some sense of ego, whether because, he respects Bill Mulder or because Mulder may actually be his biological son. And you have all this stuff layered on, as tends to happen, when you've got 100+ episodes of The X-Files to draw on. But again, because this is the movie and because it's archetypal, we go straight back to the if you kill him, you'll make him a martyr, which is one of the first excuses the show offered, and then kind of after that realised that it had to broaden and deepen it. Again, this is the sense of drawing, kind of painting with a broad brush. And again, it's notable that that line has traditionally been given to the cigarette-smoking man. Here, the cigarette-smoking man doesn't seem to feel that particularly strongly one way or the other about offing Mulder. And again, that's because you're playing for mass audiences, because the cigarette-smoking man is the villain of the piece. He's Darth Vader to, Strughold's emperor in this story, and particularly the way he's introduced getting out of the kind of helicopter with the low-angle shot to underscore how evil he is, because he's one of the most iconic villains in pop culture in the 90s, which is something insane to say in terms of the movie's reach. So again, while to X-Files fans, the cigarette-smoking man is maybe Mulder's father, a conflicted figure, a character with his own agenda and motivations, the film is very much geared as much towards audiences that are like, well, the cigarette-smoking man is pure evil and one of the embodiments of pure evil. So the idea of, well, let's not rush into this, basically falls to the Well-Manicured Man, who is, again, a character whose viewpoint we align with, but who, as the film goes on, is designed to be more sympathetic, and who, by narrative expedience, needs to get the lines in these scenes that establish him as, again, more sympathetic. And it's worth noting as well that, like, we joked about, like, the level of exposition and the kind of background details. What bringing Mulder and Scully back into this does immediately and very effectively is it establishes stakes. It makes the kind of conflict and drama immediately scalable to the audience who are watching it. Again, the audience who are invested primarily in Mulder and Scully. And again, there's a question of kind of wondering at what point does this, at what point does this fall apart? At what point why would you let Kurzweil be out there writing these books even if nobody was caring about it? And again, you could have a long conversation about how it creates a sense of deniability. It adds this sense of postmodernism to it, where it's like, if it's out there, he seems like a crank, and therefore it provides cover that we can again use to deny, other stuff that we actually get caught doing. But, the film kind of glosses over that very, very quickly, because it's like, no, this is Mulder and Scully, and this is how they're related to this, and this is why these people meeting in this room are a threat to Mulder and Scully. And actually, this gets to the closing line of the sequence, which is, probably the most important line of the entire conversation, of the entire kind of several minutes we've been talking about it, which is the point at which you get the line, and again, it's one of those lines from the trailer, which again is an example of Fight the Future being written for the big screen as opposed to television, where you have Kurzweil delivering the line, and I can't do Muller-style justice here. I'm almost tempted to ask you to just slot it in over what I'm about to read, but then you must take away what he holds most valuable, that with which he can't live without. And again, you have had, up until this point, characters talking very bluntly about colonizations and vaccines, and all of a sudden, Carter just flips the switch into purple prose. And it's like, you get a sense that, like, as soon as we cut away to Scully, the scene in that meeting room in Alexandra House continues, with the Well-Manicured Man just standing there shrugging his shoulders going, yes, what do you mean? What are you saying? I'm going to need you to be a bit more specific. Just tell me exactly what you want us to do here. But the film kind of understands that, like, the audience that might not be invested in vaccines, colonization, hybridization, is immediately invested in the idea of Mulder and Scully, is immediately understands intrinsically that, like, for all this is a show about, again, what we talked about, the kind of the sins buried beneath that kind of wonderful playground that you're about to see, listeners. It is also fundamentally about Mulder and Scully. And so you understand intrinsically that what Strughold is threatening is Scully, and you get that wonderful cut at the end of the minute where it's like, in case you don't get what Strughold is threatening, here's a shot of Scully.
Yeah, and that wraps up the latest Fight the Future minute as well. So I want to thank everyone for listening. If Darren, before we do go, because this is our final section for us, we'll be back later in the film. So no doubt we'll talk a lot more about Well-Manicured Man at some point. But have you got any final thoughts on the minutes that we've talked about? And then can you just give us an idea of where people can find you online?
I do feel a little bad that I didn't get any of the romantic comedy moments. But no, to be fair, I've talked on the podcast before about how I'm a huge fan of John Neville, and the Well-Manicured Man is one of my favourite characters in the entire history of the show. So thank you very much, Kurt, and thank you very much, Tony, for putting my name down opposite all these numbers, opposite all these minutes. And I actually do think that they are, like, I think the Well-Manicured Man's arc in the film is actually pretty great, considering how low he is on the casting sheet and how easy it would be to brush him aside and how much else is happening in the movie. And I think that Neville is really, really good in it, but I also think the film's understanding of his character and, again, the efficiency of the use of its character, and that's down to the script. It's also down to Bowman's direction in the way he composes and frames shots. I think it's really, really, really well constructed in terms of doing what it sets out to do. Again, I feel like I've been unfairly harsh over the past couple of minutes talking about how, efficient it is, as if that's some sort of insult, that it's not elegant or poetic or kind of, that efficiency is impressive of itself and a sign of a production team who understand what they're working with, understand who they're writing for, and understand kind of the differences between working on a television show that has a very active fan base as compared to a feature film that is competing against Men in Black. And I think that the movie deserves a lot of credit for doing that. I don't think it always gets that credit. And I understand that as a fan who, we've talked a fair bit about there being kind of gaps or kind of like lacunas in continuity that exist, or kind of like thematic black holes or kind of little inconsistencies between the TV show and the film. But again, I think in terms of balancing, the film does it remarkably well. And I think the fact that we've been able to talk so much about these minutes, and the fact that like so much of what we talked about has been positive and kind of interesting and kind of digging into it, kind of is a testament to those minutes. So I'm actually really glad I got to talk about them. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Kurt. I really, really appreciate it.
No, it's absolutely a pleasure to be able to be on the show with you again. As always, it's always good to have a good discussion with you, and we've done it on several occasions on many different shows. But speaking of different shows, so where can people find you online? What you I know this will be recorded. This is recorded quite a bit in advance. So, but just generally, where can people find you online, and what you're generally up to?
You can follow me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney, where I'm typically talking about lots of nonsense, basically whatever I've been watching recently and whatever's running through my head, as scary as that might be. I'm also co-host a podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn. Which is basically a podcast where we go through the IMDb's top 250 and worst 100 movies of all time, one at a time. So each week we take a different movie and we talk about it and we kind of discuss it. We offer a bit of production history, we talk about our experiences with it, and we talk about whether or not it belongs on a list of the 250 greatest movies ever made. I also write at my own blog, The Movie Blog, with a 0 instead of an O in movie. And you can find my writing at The Escapist magazine online, actually, which I am very proud of. I'm very glad to be a part of that as well. And on the off chance that anybody's listening in Ireland, you can listen to me on Thursday mornings at 8:15 on Q102, Dublin's radio station, which is great. I'm actually really glad to be on there. I get to talk about movies for 10 minutes a week on national radio, which apparently has involved me doing terrible impressions of Ray Winston and Russell Crowe. So hey, who knows what I'm going to do next week?
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Darren, for coming on again, and we'll see you in the future. And before we go, you can find me on Twitter at rmuldrake. That's RMULDRAKE. You can also find the Time Is Now podcast for those people who are interested in the X-Files. We do have the Millennium, the sister show to the X-Files, which is a show that I run. And Darren, you've been on that a few times as well, so you can find that on the Time Is Now pod. And also, you can find me, we've recently done the Make It So podcast, the podcast about Star Trek Picard. So that would have finished by now, but we have some interesting developments on that. So by the time this airs, there'll be some new podcasts on the Make It So podcast. And but yeah, so that's basically it for us. So thank you very much for joining us. We will be back in the future to discuss more of Fight the Future.
So Kurt,
yes.
Just a quick question. Are you telling me that Make It So has mutated?
Make It So has mutated. God knows what to, but...
My God.
My God.
Into what?
It's mutated into... Do you know what it's mutated into? Mutated into a Star Trek Universe podcast. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll be back.
No, pleasure. Thank you.
We will be back. But there'll be more minutes. There's a new host, new guest. They're going to be talking Mulder and Scully, snooping around the kids' playground. There's a lot of depth to that, Darren, which unfortunately you won't be talking about, but we shall take it from there. But until next time, everyone, remember, as always, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Pick a disc.
I think some songs also have like all those like interludes with like samples and spoken word as well. It kind of fits into like the shambolic, but in a good way, nature of it.
Yeah, okay. I like the fact that no song ever really ends as such. They're all just like the guitars stop and then there's a little bit of electronics that kind of lull you through into the next track and stuff like that. I like it's an organic thing, isn't it? It's kind of like a DJ set where the dude is just obsessed with the one band and he keeps circling back to it.
Pull or pass?
I think it would be really weird if they tried to make the Fantastic Four something that had been around, but they didn't get involved in the Infinity War, you know?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think post-Infinity War, it kind of becomes curious how you introduce heroes in a long-standing, like if they were always meant to be there capacity. But
yeah. And unless they have a film set in the 60s and they kill them off. I mean, they could do that, couldn't they?
Without a mouse.
When me and my wife got married in 2015, we booked our honeymoon to California and went to Disneyland in California. As soon as we decided we were going to do that, I'd always wanted to go there, but mainly for the rides, not for the Disney side of things so much. Yeah. And I started watching loads of... I know I've heard you mention before, like the Disney food blog, YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I will sit there when I'm bored. I'm either watching synthesizer demos, random music videos, or stuff about what food not to eat in Walt Disney World, which I've never been to and I'm not that likely to go to in the near future.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.